Good morning. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
My God, we thank you for a day as we continue to walk through the story of Daniel. May we continue to see what it means to live with integrity in a world that doesn't always look like the world you want. Amen.
Amen.
I have a few handouts. First, I have our just handout for today. And then the second is the one I forgot to give you last week, the Bible Project poster. And then on the other side is the poster I made for Daniel. So you can look at those. I have another handout, but you don't get to see it yet.
You're teasing us.
Now that we've been in Daniel for 2 weeks, who's read the whole book?
Probably at some time.
But not for this.
But not,
No, okay.
we didn't jump ahead.
Yeah. Well, I didn't know if anyone maybe had read it thus far. What are your thoughts on Daniel so far?
It's a good read.
It is a good read.
Yeah, easy.
I like it a lot more than Revelation.
Yeah. A lot easier.
It's easier. I think Daniel's hilarious. It's funny to me.
It's uplifting too.
You think it's uplifting? Just wait till next week.
I'm in trouble.
Is there any part for anyone that has really stood out to you in particular, Bill?
Historically, scholars have somewhat arbitrarily divided the Old Testament prophets into major and minor.
Okay, yeah.
Would you consider Daniel one of the major prophets?
So in Christian Bibles, we organize them into major and minor prophets. The way that we distinguish between major and minor is how big they are. But in the Hebrew Bible, Daniel is not a prophet. It's not in the prophets.
It's not a major prophet.
It's not any prophet. Daniel is in the writings. And so, like, the Hebrew Bible, they call it the Tanakh. It's the Torah, the Nehevim, and the Ketuvim, which is it's the Torah, the prophets, and then the writings. And so Daniel is part of the writings, not a prophet. It is very prophetic, which is why in Christian Bibles they moved where it is and they put it where it's with the prophets. But for the original writers and hearers of Daniel, it's not a prophet, it's a writing, just like the Psalms would be, or the Proverbs would be, or other books like that, Song of Solomon, those types of books. So when I think about it, I try to think about it like that. That was a good question. We probably should have said that last week. You should have asked that last week. Did anyone have any other questions on today's material or just really highlights of the book?
Who wrote Daniel anyway?
Daniel is a compilation of writers. I can jump up ahead to that slide in here. So Daniel happens in 3 main stages. The first part is chapters 2 through 6. They were written in Aramaic. And then and scholars think that was kind of a compilation of stories about people living in exile. And they all come together and kind of they combine those stories into a character called Daniel. Then they add chapters 1 and 7. And then later they add on chapters 8 through 12 in Hebrew. And then there's other additions to Daniel. And Daniel has lots of versions. We will actually see that today. In particular, chapter 3. Chapter 3 has lots of versions in different collections. And so what I always try to encourage people, and I had this same slide last week, Daniel is a living tale or a book. And so in different cultures, it is adapted and it's retold and it's edited and names are changed and the stories are rearranged. They add stories. And in that same way, Daniel is like a living tale for us. because we can take those same stories about how to live with integrity as a people of God in a world that doesn't look like God's world. And so we should be like Daniel. And so if you have stories of someone that lives with integrity, add it to Daniel. And whoever had integrity, call them Daniel. And whoever was the bad ruler, call them Nebuchadnezzar. Because this story is true throughout all time. It's ageless and timeless.
What's important about it being written in 3 languages?
It's weird that it's written in Aramaic. Some scholars will point to it maybe having a stylistic pattern. So chapter 1 is now in Hebrew. Chapters 2 through 7 are in Aramaic. 8 through 12 are in Hebrew. But then you also have Greek versions of it that were for Jews living in Egypt. The part about it being in Hebrew, when I look at it, that part was written later. Daniel is really one of the last books to be written. And it's it's way after Alexander the Great. It's like 200 years before Jesus in the 160s, like maybe around 164. There was a Greek emperor that came in. He conquered Jerusalem. He took out items from the temple. They removed the sacred items. They put up idols inside the temple. And there was a lot of conversation for Jews about what it meant to be a Jew. Does it mean to be Hebrew? Or can you live a Hellenistic lifestyle? Can you live like a Greek? And so the switch back to Hebrew at the end of Daniel is a way of reclaiming that kind of Hebrew identity. And so if you find yourself ever living in a foreign world, remember who you are as a person of God. For me, that doesn't mean speaking Hebrew, but for them it did.
I read the story of Esther, which was interesting after reading that Daniel chapter in exile.
Esther is another one of those living tales, those living stories. There is additional endings to the book of Esther that are also in Greek. And kind of what's funny is that Esther almost didn't make it into the Bible because it never mentions God in the Hebrew version. And it's I think it's like the first paragraph or the first sentence in the Greek version. They're like, hey, we probably should name God. And so then they're like, okay, we'll say something about God here. Esther is also Rachel's favorite Old Testament book. So when we got married or for an anniversary, I got her this scroll of Esther in Hebrew. That is cool. It's in this tube with, it has like a chiseled out piece of metal that tells the story. That's so random. Okay. So today we are doing chapters 3 through 6 of Daniel. Next week and the week after, we will complete the book of Daniel, but there's going to be a tonal shift. So right now we're in those court stories. So they're the court stories of resistance, is what I'm calling them. Next week we'll be in those apocalyptic visions of hope. And so if you didn't like that part of Revelation, it's not as bad as Revelation, and it goes much quicker. We will also, on the last day, fit in the Greek editions very, very lightly. Keep in mind, I keep saying this, but Daniel is a living tale. And so it's readapted, it's retold. You could almost think about Daniel as a movie. And if you've ever watched a movie written from a book, you will know that sometimes they change characters, they merge characters together, the timeline will change, and it's because you're telling it in a different medium. Daniel is like that with history. We will see that today. It's adapted and changed. Sometimes characters are merged together because it makes a better story. And Daniel's a story that we can always tell, and we can always add to it. If you're one who watches online, you will see a long discussion with some random person on the internet and me from the video last week because someone recognized that some of the history in Daniel doesn't match. We'll see that today with real history. And so I gave them an answer. And if you're bored, you can go look at it. Here is the history of what happened. So the story of Daniel was set back in this time period. We said this last week. It's set back during the Babylonian exile, and as we'll see today, right when the Medo-Persian Empire comes. But Daniel doesn't get written for a few more centuries, at least in the version that we have it. And so sometimes Daniel's a little bit anachronistic. Like, for instance, we'll see this today, and we saw it last week. They use Persian numbers and Persian titles and Persian aristocrats, but they talk about it like it was back there in Babylon. Or they will do the same thing with some things that were happening way back before the Maccabean revolt that are 400 years later. Like, again, today we'll see that when Belshazzar is drinking, he's having his party with the vessels from the temple. That doesn't happen until right before the Maccabean revolt. And this was that history we talked about, how Alexander the Great's empire gets all split up. We saw that in Nebuchadnezzar's dream last week. These are the Seleucids. They come in and they conquer Judah. That's the context from which Daniel was written way back later in about the 160s. There's also a few characters that I had told you to remember last week, and I have a correction on something that I said. Obviously, there's Daniel. We want to remember him. There's Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is any bad king anywhere. There's also these wise men or magicians. We're going to see them again today. It's all these people serving in the Babylonian court that are supposed to be able to interpret dreams and meanings. They're very bad at their job, though. There's this fourth guy in the fire. We're going to meet him today. King Cyrus. He's going to pop up today. And then there is Daniel's friends. And last week, I'm not sure what confusion happened in my brain, but I told you that their Babylonian names are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that we know those names. Their Hebrew names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. I told you that the book refuses to call them by their Babylonian names. I was completely, utterly, and hopelessly wrong. They are called by their Babylonian names throughout the book. I am sorry about that. I'm going to reclaim it from one of the commentaries I like says, the empire can rename them, but they can't claim them. And so even though they are called by their Babylonian names, which all have to do with the Babylonian gods, they never follow those gods or live their way of life. So they can name them, but they can't claim them. I already showed you this slide. There's the first part of the court tales, the second part, which is the apocalyptic visions. We'll get there in the next 2 weeks. And then this is our long overview of where we were. Last week, though, we talked about how Daniel and his friends ended up in Nebuchadnezzar's court. They get captured. The king goes and wants to serve him the royal food, and they refuse. I shared this fun meme. It's the first and last time that a teenage boys refused food. So they would not eat the food of the king. It's not because the food wasn't kosher. It's because it was the king's food. And they weren't going to live a lifestyle that the king lived. They kind of go through this indoctrination program to be re-educated. But Daniel and his friends say, we won't participate in any of that. And they end up becoming better than every other wise man or court official. And so they get elevated to kind of a higher point. It's a way of showing us how to live. How do we live with integrity? Be good at your job and attribute that goodness to God. That's how you should be like Daniel. We then got into chapter 2 with Nebuchadnezzar and his dream. He had this dream of a big statue. It had a gold head. It had a silver chest, bronze legs, and then feet of clay that were mixed with other metals. And this dream was about the kind of succession of power that was going to be with the empires. And you'll remember this big rock comes and kind of breaks it apart. And we talked about how that refers to Babylon, and then the Medes, and then the Persians, and eventually the Greek Empire. And there's 2 legs because the Greek Empire gets split in 2. But no matter what kingdom looks like it's all over the world, God's kingdom is going to come and take over all of that. And so this big rock comes, and it's like a mountain. And that's God's kingdom that nothing can take away because God is stronger than any other. That was what we looked at last week. Today, though, we're going to look at chapters 3 through 5. Chapter 3 is going to have another statue of Nebuchadnezzar's, not his dream, but a real statue. And then we're going to see the fiery furnace. I also just want you to know that there is 2 additions in Greek to chapter 3. There's the prayer of Azariah and the song of the 3 Jews. We talked about these some last week. They're in our prayer book. I think it's for morning prayer is when we do the prayer of Azariah. And Azariah is one of Daniel's friends. It's after the fiery furnace. And so it's their response of praising God. We will not look at that for 2 weeks, but just hold on to your brain that it happens after chapter 3, just not in Protestant Bibles. Chapter 3 is going to deal with Nebuchadnezzar having this statue and building a fiery furnace. I'm going to pass this picture around. This is called the three youths in the fiery furnace. It's from the early to mid 1700s. And I thought it was just a fantastic imagery that kind of describes this chapter. And so kind of while that's passing around, I just want to point a few things out about this. So here's this gold statue. This is not the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. You think he would learn his lesson about dreams after last week, but right after that he goes, oh, God's great, but I'm pretty great too, so I'm going to make a statue so everyone can worship me. And we see how that will turn out today. We'll learn about it, but Daniel's friends refuse to bow down to the statue. They get thrown in the fiery furnace. So they are over there. You can kind of see some of the temples of Babylon. And everyone is worshiping the statue, but God is still on top over here. And the heavenly creatures are still there. They don't bow down to Nebuchadnezzar because they see how little he is. Sometimes in life we think we are on top. And it looks like from our perspective, we're like Nebuchadnezzar. We've got it all figured out. We are so secure. We are so safe. There's moments like this in Daniel that God goes, haha, no. There's also just other really cool art. I just wanted to show you some of them. And you'll notice in all of the ones of Daniel's friends, there's always like another figure protecting them. I found that to be very comforting this week. And I will play you a song in a little bit. But when they go into the fiery furnace, they don't know if God will rescue them or not. They just know that for them to follow with their integrity of following God, they cannot bow down to this statue. They won't give in even a little bit. And their faithfulness and their faith in God is what takes them there. But it's not faith that they will be rescued. It's just faithfulness for following God as they understood it. And God was there with them in that. In the story, they get rescued from that furnace. In real life, that doesn't always happen. But God's always with us in the midst of that. And I found that comforting. And I found that comforting about this art. How there's always like this angel protecting them. Almost like a guardian angel. Chapter 3 is going to begin. Nebuchadnezzar makes this really big statue. It's roughly about 90 feet tall or 9 feet thick. That's a lot taller than people back in the day would build statues. So it's when you read this, you would go, that's an unreasonably big statue. Wow. And it's kind of like if you could make a joke about the men that drive really big pickup trucks, that's kind of the idea that you get with Nebuchadnezzar. He is really trying to show himself as awesome. The way that it's laid out is he builds this statue, and everyone in the kingdom is going to come and bow down to it. The way it's laid out in the text, in mine, it's the satraps. I don't even know how to say that word. I had to look it up. The prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates. It keeps going down and down. It's a list from greatest to least of who is the greatest in various empires. The terms that it uses are a mixture of Babylonian and Persian and Greek officials kind of in the empire or in the court. And all of these people from all around the world are coming in the story to come and bow down to this statue to worship Nebuchadnezzar. There's a lot of humor that gets mixed in this story. I put some of it in the fun facts, but just one of them for you to hold on to is every time that there is you see it in verse 5 of chapter 3. When you hear the sound of a horn or a pipe or a lyre or a trigon or a harp or a drum, and the entire musical ensemble, it goes through this list of music. And it's just like a long list. And when you read it in the text, it's humorous. Because it's like annoyingly detailed, and it just keeps these long lists going out and what you're supposed to do when you respond. And so I just want to know, chapter 3 is making fun of the Babylonians. And it keeps making fun of the Babylonians. And so when you read it, laugh a little bit, because it's funny. They come and they bow down and they are to worship him. Any questions on that? When you go back and read this, laugh every time it makes these really long, annoying lists. Because these are not annoying long lists to be annoying, like genealogies. These are to be funny. Make fun of the Babylonians. When this comes, though, Daniel's friends refuse to participate. And so they will not bow down when they hear the long list of musical instruments. And I love this part. First off is their offense. They refuse to do it, and they get accused of it. If your Bible says the Chaldeans, that is the Babylonians. Historicists might call it Neo-Babylonians. It's the new empire of the Babylonians, but that's just what the Babylonians are called. It's Chaldeans. And so they end up having this confrontation with Nebuchadnezzar because they refuse to bow down to the statue. And what I find inspiring about their response to Nebuchadnezzar is how just bold that they are. They just say, no, we're not going to do that. We can't do that. We will not do that. And I love the line that they give. This is verse 17 and 18. Summarized. He says, our God is able to deliver us, but if not, we will not serve your gods. I love their boldness that they have. While they're talking to the most powerful man in the world at the time, and with I get the idea, with straight faces, they say, well, we could die, but that's okay. I'm still not going to follow you. And God might help us. He might not, but I still won't worship you. I love that. And for me, that's inspiring. It gives us, remember we talked about Daniel as being an example of how to live with integrity. Be brave, because God's on our side. And we don't have to appease to power structures that may seem powerful now, but those things are always just a glimpse. It's a very good tale on bravery and how to follow it. What ends up happening is that they get thrown into this fiery furnace. In the text, it's also another kind of humorous part because they're 3 teenagers, and Nebuchadnezzar calls the strongest men to come and bind them and to make the fire 7 times hotter than it should be. Because he wants them to be consumed. While they're in the fire, this 4th figure appears. In the text, it will describe it as someone who was like a son of God. For us as Christians, a lot of Christian commentators will say this is what they call a pre-incarnate Christ. And so the incarnation is when God became flesh, like Jesus walked on earth. But there are moments where God appears on earth before that. And so we call those the pre-incarnate Christ, where the figure of Jesus is there. That is what Christians will call this. For Jews, they viewed it as like some type of angel or heavenly being that was there. No matter what, and for me, I kind of see it more like Jesus, but it's God's presence with them in the fire. And so remember those pictures of there with the guardian angel. When we go through these difficult times, God is there with us. Particularly when we follow God with integrity. God does not abandon us. And then I almost forgot to say this. When they come out of the fire, Nebuchadnezzar ends up, again, because we already saw this, paying homage to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That is to say, Yahweh, God. And he goes even a step further so that all others have to recognize their God as the God. And so no one is allowed to make offense at their God because he has shown himself to be so powerful. Any questions on that? You all are very quiet today. Okay. I have a song that I'm going to show for you. So I told you about last week, the song I grew up with about Daniel and the fiery furnace in the lion's den. And I could not find it. I spent a few weeks trying to find it online, but I found someone that has a CD of it in Anderson County, and I went and got it. And so I'm going to play you this lovely song. And now I have the CD. And so maybe I'll try to put it on YouTube or something. I don't know if that's allowed, but the group doesn't exist anymore. Let me turn the TVs down because I have it in the CD player. But the song is called Heat of the Flames. And so I'm just putting a background in the fireplace. Okay, your life will be changed. I'm so excited.
Meshach, Abednego stood up and told Nebuchadnezzar no. Into the fire they were thrown. Through the smoke he could see they were not alone. As the flames started bursting higher and higher, they could plainly see a fourth man in the fire. In the heat of the flames, trusting God is a fire department, he's a rescue squad. A three-alarm response, just cry out his name. He's walking with you in the heat of the flame. In the heat of the flame. Things were heating up for Daniel one day. A lion tried to put him in his grave. When that beast roared into the pit, God showed up and took care of it. That old lion lost the fire in his eyes and lay like a kitten at Daniel's side. Daniel's side. In the heat of the flames, trusting God is a fire department, he's a rescue squad. A three-alarm response, just cry out his name. He's walking with you in the heat of the flame. 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 In the heat of the flames, trusting God is a fire department, he's a rescue squad. A three-alarm response, just cry out his name. He's walking with you in the heat of the flame. 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 In the heat of the flame.
I love the amount of you laughing.
Sound like the Oak Ridge Boys do.
Well, I was thinking I could give that to Jim in the choir. There's a few things I like about that song.
He could play that as a children's march out.
Oh, hey, that would be fun. There's a few things I like about that song. The first part is just the humor of it, which I'll come back to in just a second. But the second is that's really comforting. In the heat of the flames, trust in God. You know, he's a fire department, he's a rescue squad. Also, I remember this song differently because I have not heard it in like 20 years, and I have remembered different versions of it in my brain. But I do like this song, and I will play it again for you after class because I want it to get stuck in your heads, like it has for me for a few decades. The other part I really like about this song is the humor in it, and I don't want you to miss the humor that plays out throughout Daniel. Again, that part in chapter 3 where they keep listing the long ceremony. He builds this elaborate statue. It's every government official from around the world. Fill in every single Supreme Court justice, the House of Representatives, every senator, the prime minister from every country comes and bows down to this statue of the most powerful emperor. And there's a long list of, the flute is played and the banjo and all of this. And then these three teenagers just go, no. And then they get thrown in the hottest furnace with the largest soldiers, and they just walk out unscathed, not even their clothes. There's this humor. It's making fun of Babylon and of the gods that go against God. So remember, it's about integrity when we walk with God. And that means we can make fun of others because, no, that means we can have a piece of humor. And so that silly song, take some humor with you. It's okay. The Bible's hilarious, and we can be too. After this, though, we're going to go into chapter 4. And Nebuchadnezzar is going to have another dream, and he's going to have this madness of a beast. You may have seen this graphic before from your faces, maybe you haven't. This is kind of the most popular version of that depicts Nebuchadnezzar with this madness of the beast. Here's another one that's a little bit older. I think the other one is based off of this one. But we're going to see, we'll talk about this in a second. Here in the first 18 verses, Nebuchadnezzar is going to have this dream of a great tree. Let's see. One part that's interesting about this, the chapter begins with Nebuchadnezzar praising God. He uses, the Hebrew is El Elyon. It is the Most High God. It's a depiction that's not just used for Yahweh, but for any God that is the Most High God. And here Nebuchadnezzar is praising our God as the Most High God. Talks about how awesome God is. But then he has this weird dream. Also, the text is changing in the type of genre it is. Whereas before we've been dealing with like a literary style that just tells stories. This is written like a kingly decree that is sent out to the whole nation. I don't know why you would write to the whole nation about your nightmare, but that's how it is here in the text. And Nebuchadnezzar has this dream of this great tree, and all the birds of the earth gather under this tree for safety and for protection. What ends up happening is that this holy watcher comes and cuts down the tree but leaves a stump. Weird dream. I also want to remind you of one thing. Just a second, we'll talk about what the dream means. But remember how I keep saying Daniel is a living tale? I'm just going to read this, and then I'll talk about it in a second. Some ancient versions of this story point to King Nebuchadnezzar, or however you say his name, rather than Nebuchadnezzar as the original subject. The Dead Sea Scrolls even include a version where a Jewish seer heals the other king of his disease after he acknowledges Israel's God. By placing this story in Nebuchadnezzar's voice, the book of Daniel reframes history into a universal lesson. No matter how powerful a ruler may be, God alone is sovereign, and pride leads to the fall. Let me come. Where do I have my text? Oh, here it is. So Nebuchadnezzar was a real king for Babylon. There was also another king named Nebuchadnezzar. I don't know how to say his name. We're going to call him Nebo. Nebo was the last king of Babylon before the Persians took over. He is not a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. He just pops up, or at least he doesn't have it in the historical record, a connection to Nebuchadnezzar, but he becomes the king. He does have a son named Belshazzar, which we're going to see in the next chapter. Belshazzar was never a king in Babylon, but he did rule as a regent, while Nebo had a spiritual experience for 7 years, where he went out into the wilderness. This is a true story. Seeking after this other god this isn't the light, but almost to find enlightenment, to seek this other god. He goes out, kind of forgets that he's an emperor for 7 years. That probably led to Babylon's downfall and how the Persians were able to capture it so quickly. But in other versions of Daniel, like in the oldest Greek versions and even in the Hebrew versions in the Dead Sea Scrolls, this chapter doesn't have it as Nebuchadnezzar as the figure. It's the other king. The version that we have eases the story up and just makes it the same character for us. And it reads better. It's also longer in our versions. But remember, we talked about how you adapt movies and you merge characters together because it's better storytelling. Our version of Daniel is a much better story because it's easier to tell. Any questions on that? Because I feel like there might be.
Yes, Alexander.
Yes.
In my Bible, we're looking at chapter 4.
Okay.
Verse 19, mine says, then Daniel, and in parentheses, also called Belshazzar. So
there's Belshazzar, and then there's Belshazzar without the T.
Yeah.
Belshazzar.
Why do they, he has two names then.
No. So Belshazzar was, we don't know him yet, but he is the last ruler in Babylon.
Right. And I remember reading that.
Yeah.
But
Daniel, Daniel and his friends all have a Hebrew name and a Babylonian name.
okay.
So this would be what the,
So let me tell you what their name means. So this is on a different slide that I skipped. I'm glad I kept it in here just in case. So Daniel means God is my judge, which is Hebrew. Belteshazzar means Bel is my judge, or Bel is my prince. The other names also have different meanings. All of the Babylonian names are connected to Babylonian gods, and it's almost like the inverse of their Hebrew names. Belshazzar means Bel, I think, will protect the king. So the other King Belshazzar, their names are so complicated. For my word. They are different. So maybe that's why in Daniel they kept calling him Daniel so we wouldn't get confused. I feel like there might be more questions on this part. This is what that random YouTube person really got hot and bothered by, was about this king. Okay. Random YouTube guy, if you're there, you can still watch these videos. Okay. I forgot that this is recording. I'm going to play you a video that's going to tell the dream. It's also going to tell you the part about Daniel's interpretation. Cool.
I had a dream which made me afraid. The images I saw terrified me. Belteshazzar, I looked and saw before me a tree in the middle of the land. The tree grew strong and tall. Its top touched the sky, and it was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves, they were beautiful. Its fruit was abundant. The beasts of the field took shelter under it. The birds of the air lived in its branches, and from it every creature was fed. Then I looked again, and I saw a messenger coming down from heaven, and he cried out aloud, "Cut down the tree, trim off its branches, strip its leaves, scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it and the birds fly from its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound in iron and brass, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. Let it be drenched by the dew from heaven. Let it live with the animals of the earth, and let its mind be changed from that of a man to the mind of an animal." This is the dream that I had. What does it mean?
My lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries. The tree which you saw, which grew large and strong with its top touching the sky, you, O king, are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to the distant parts of the earth. You saw a messenger, a holy one, coming down from heaven, saying, "Cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump bound with iron and bronze in the grass of the field, while its roots remain in the ground. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live like wild animals." This is the interpretation, O king. And this is the decree that the Most High has issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from people and live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that the Most High rules.
Well, at least this time he told him the dream. He didn't have to.
Yeah, right.
I'm trying to get my mouse over.
Enter.
Yeah.
I'll let you do that there.
I'm just trying to find it. You can ask me the. There we go.
Yeah, I've got a question. Do you want to say something first?
No.
If Daniel and the three kings are a composite to show a storyline,
Yeah.
is any of it true what happened with the kings at this time? Did they really have dreams? Were any of this historically?
So it was very typical for Babylonians to have these wise men. I mentioned this last week, but like the Magi that we read about in the Gospels possibly came from Babylon, and that maybe they knew the story of Isaiah and some of the other prophets from the exile. When the Jews lived there, they brought them. And so that was part of their job, was to interpret the dreams and everything like that. In a lot of ancient cultures, not just Babylonians, dreams would have meaning. I know when I was a kid, even as a teenager, I'd have a dream, be like, it was a message from God. What did that mean?
Right.
And so that was pretty typical. For the other parts, I would say maybe this would be more like a legendary tale.
Okay.
Like there was a Nebuchadnezzar, but this is in like when we watch a movie and it's like based on a true story. That's what this is like. There is names. These are events that some of them did happen. But the point isn't.
Some of them did happen, but we don't know.
Like they actually did go and live here in exile. The point of the book of Daniel, though, is not to tell you the history of that exile. It's to tell you how to live if you ever find yourself in exile.
Right.
So, I mean, I would read this I would take off a history book hat and go put that somewhere else and put on your theology and how do I live like this hat on. And if you can throw a stone at me. Any other questions related to that? Okay. Nebuchadnezzar was a king, and he was, at that point, the most powerful person in the world.
Yeah.
So, because we already heard the interpretation of that dream, that's not what I paid as much attention to in this slide. It's how Daniel acted, because it's a lesson for us, but let's just retouch on that dream. Nebuchadnezzar has this dream that there is a great tree. The great tree is often a motif for great kings or great empires and the protection that they provide. This holy watcher or this angel, God sends someone to come and cut down that tree. They're cutting down that empire. But there is hope for Nebuchadnezzar if he can recognize that God, in particular Israel's God, is the most powerful God, and not him and his gods. Then he can be restored and he can have his empire back. Until that time, though, he is going to spend 7 years like a beast out in the wilderness. And there's descriptions of him kind of being like a beast and doing beast stuff. I want to just see, though, Daniel's response, because the first part is Daniel is scared. Let's go back in here. He's talking to the most powerful man in the world who asks, what does my dream mean? And he's about to say, you're going to lose everything. And so the first part, and you see it in the story, I wish this was about your enemies. But Daniel speaks plainly, in part because Nebuchadnezzar asked him to. He says, don't be afraid to share. But Daniel is fearful. He also is going to recite then what happens in the dream. And then we're going to see kind of what happens with it. There's a promise of restoration, even in those hard truths. Sometimes God will speak hard truths to us, but there's always this promise of restoration, that God will restore us. We are not a punished people. These things happen to help us learn and to grow, like all of Israel being in exile. And that's somewhat what this story is like. Israel was, and Judah were kingdoms that stood on their own. But the way that the Bible talks about why they lost those positions of power and ended up in exile was because of their disobedience. It was a lesson for them so that they could learn about God. Same thing stands true for us. After this, Nebuchadnezzar is going to have some humiliation. was struggling spelling his name on the slide, so I switched to Nebi halfway through. So the first part, when we get into verse 28 through verse 33, he's going to end up boasting. And so I put a picture here. Actually, hey, I should have added this as a fun fact, but King Nebuchadnezzar was the one who made the floating gardens. And so it was one of the wonders of the ancient world, was these floating gardens in Babylon, in the capital. And King Nebuchadnezzar was the one who did that. And so he starts off boasting, "Is not magnificent Babylon, which I have built as a royal capital by my mighty power and for my glorious majesty?" And while he is speaking this voice comes down and says, "You have lost that position of power." And then Nebuchadnezzar is humbled. And his humbling is by living like a beast out in the wilderness for 7 years, until he kind of comes to. Let me stop. Any questions on that?
How do we know? Why was it 7 years?
Because the other king, the Nebo, or however you say his name, that was how long he spent out in the wilderness on his spirit journey. And so that was a historical part, that the king was gone for 7 years. Also, 7's a nice round number of completion and perfection. Fun fact, too. I didn't include this in the fun facts, but the statue is using the Babylonian numbering system, which is based on 60 and not 10, like ours is. Kind of interesting. Now you know. So they did that because you have 60 body parts. And you can count a lot more than just 10, because we have 10 fingers. And so, yeah. Also, in other cultures, it used to be based on a base 12, which is why we have 1 dozen still in our language. We kind of held on to that. Nobody cares. Okay. So Nebi's going to end up praising God. And so he kind of comes to after this moment of 7 years. And if you pick up in verse 34, I'm just going to read the first line. "When that period was over, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. I blessed the Most High and praised." We're going back to, this is a royal decree that is sent out. And so this chapter serves for the whole empire, this picture of the power of God through the humbling of Nebuchadnezzar. And so he kind of had his moment of purgatory for this 7 years until he could recognize that God was the Most High God. And then he ends up praising God, and then he is restored to his power. Now, I took the poem, essentially, that Nebuchadnezzar has, and then added it to the last 2 verses of this chapter, and we're going to read it like a psalm. And so we're going to read it back and forth. I'm going to read the line that's underlined, and then you all are the response. Does that make sense? Okay. And then there is one change that I made in the text at the very last of the chapter. He says, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol." When you say it, say your own name instead of Nebuchadnezzar's name. God's sovereignty is an everlasting sovereignty.
And God's kingdom endures from generation to generation.
All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing.
And God does what God wills with the hosts of heaven.
And the inhabitants of the earth.
There is no one to say nothing.
Or say to God, "What are you doing?"
Now I am praise and extol on the King of heaven.
For all God's works are true, and God's ways are justice.
And God is able to bring all above the soul those who walk in front.
Thanks be to God.
Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah.
I'll say this again. I said this last week. When you come to moments in your Bible where suddenly the text looks different, like it's a poem or a prayer, pray it. Sometimes they're not good ones to pray. But practice it and engage with it. I have a tendency when I see like the text that's different, I skip over it faster for some reason. I don't know why my brain wants to do that. So I have to take intentional moments to pause. And doing something like this for me is very helpful, and I would just offer it to you. I find it meaningful. That is the end of chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar's dream, he has this madness of the beast. It becomes this picture to all of Babylon for how God is the Most High God and how God can lower anyone who is in those high places. Then we get to chapter 5. We're going to see Belshazzar's arrogance and then this writing on the wall, which is going to depict the fall of all of Babylon. And we'll make that note. Thank you, Anne, for pointing that out, because I don't know if I ever actually realized that, but Daniel's name was Belteshazzar. There's an extra T in there. This one's just Belshazzar, which I'm going to tell you what his name means on the next slide. Okay. And so Daniel, let's see. No, Daniel doesn't pop up at first. Sorry, I had the wrong notes on this part. So we're going to be introduced to Belshazzar. This name means Bel, protect the king. And just a little note on him as a historical figure. Here in the text, remember, this is like our movie adaptation. It's made for a better story. And it's easier to say he was Nebuchadnezzar's son. That is not true. He was Nabo's son. That is true. He was also never king, but he was regent for 7 years. So it's just adapted like a movie would be. But he was this regent for 7 years, and Nabo, Belshazzar's dad, was the last king of Babylon before the Medes and Persians capture all of Babylon. And so we're going to get like this little preview of how that happened. So we do have a time jump going on. Any questions on that? Okay. I'll say this. I did this last week. It's okay if the history changes because Daniel is a living tale about how to live with integrity in the empire. Okay. All right. Woohoo. So they're going to have this feast of folly is what I'm going to call it. So we're introduced to Belshazzar, whatever you say his name, King Bel. He is a bad guy. All right. If Nebuchadnezzar was stupid sometimes, this guy's worse, like in every way possible. What makes it even more atrocious is that he is drinking from the vessels that are from the temple. And so, he's specifically targeting the things that were captured in the Jewish temple. And these sacred vessels, they're drinking from them. This is a way of making fun of Israel's God and saying, look how powerful I am. These things you had reserved for your God, I just am going to party with and drink wine with. While he is doing this, a writing comes on the wall. And this kind of hand appears. It's going to write some stuff. I'll tell you about that in a moment. And in a similar way to Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Belshazzar is going to see if anyone can do two things. The first thing is read it. The second thing is to interpret it. And I want to just point out some more humor. You have heard me say this before. So the Jews spoke Hebrew, and there is a sister language that's Aramaic. That was the common tongue that everyone knew. That was the language you used at court. For court writings, for transactions, you use Aramaic. It was the common tongue for those types of things. Everyone should know Aramaic. And so the king calls his wise men in, and they can't even read what's written. It's making fun of them. Okay, so and it's also to say they were blind because of their folly, their arrogance, and their pride. It doesn't make sense logically, and it's because they were that stupid because they didn't follow God. You've seen how powerful God is. Why would you drink from the vessels? Okay. During this exchange, Belshazzar is trying to find someone who can figure it out. All the wise men come. And so the queen, and you could probably read her more like a queen regent here. And so maybe like his mother. And so she has kind of more power, not like one of his wives, because oftentimes queens were just made for political alliances. They did not have that much power like they do in Disney movies. But the queen mother or the queen regent, she did, because she was married to the king, and her son would be the next king. So that's kind of what it reads here. Not that that was really that important. But she's going to remember Daniel, this one who had power not only to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream, but also to tell what that dream was. And so he's going to come in to read the writing and then interpret the writing. And so the offer is to read and to interpret. But there's something else that will happen. Whoever can do that will be made the third most powerful and be given a robe of purple. And then, let me make sure that was all that there was. Oh, yes, and the gold chain around the neck. So this is to say that you will be praised if you can interpret this dream. Now, Daniel comes and he does interpret this dream, and it's a judgment that's going to come. And so the dream was that, or the writing, I'll have in a moment, it's not the dream, is that Babylon is going to fall, and specifically to the Medes and to the Persians. And we're going to see that Belshazzar is going to die. And so that's what happens. It starts off in verse 17 that Daniel is going to begin talking about Nebuchadnezzar, how God gave Nebuchadnezzar power. God gave Nebuchadnezzar that authority. How Nebuchadnezzar used that authority and how he saw who God was and acknowledged that Yahweh was more powerful. And Belshazzar should have seen all of that and also acknowledged God. But he didn't. And he made fun of God and turned on God. And so now it is the end. So that stump that we talked about, now we're going to dig up the stump. There's no more hope for Babylon. And so this is the pride that comes right before the fall. And so we saw Belshazzar's pride. Then we're going to see his fall. He dies that very night. And then Cyrus is going to come in and become the new king, who he is a Mede, but is reigning over the Persian Empire. And then Daniel is also going to get elevated to become the third most powerful in all the places. And that might sound familiar to Joseph in Egypt, and it should, because he is also an example of someone for us to follow. Okay. I want to tell you about the writing that's on the wall. It's Min-Tek Per, is what it sounds like. And what's funny is that the Min-Tek Per, something like that. But it sounds like Medes and Persians. And so there's a lot of play on words that are happening here. The mean means to count. The tekel, I'm not even going to try to say it like Hebrew, means to weigh. And the peres means to divide. And so it's your kingdom has been counted, it has been weighed, and now it's going to be divided. But it's playing on the words where it sounds like Medes and Persians. And they're going to be divided by the Medo-Persian Empire that's going to come in. Again, this is funny. It's making fun of them. It's also hilarious, and I put this as a fun fact. Let me read it. I'm going to read the very last fun fact. The repeated list of musical instruments in Daniel 3 is intentionally humorous. Scholars see it as a satirical jab at Babylon's pomp and pageantry. And then the next paragraph, the divine graffiti is written in Aramaic financial terms that we just read. Basically, your kingdoms have been audited and it's bankrupt. And this is a brilliant satire. The mighty king is undone, not by war, but by heavenly bookkeeping. And even more biting, none of Babylon's wise men could read the words. The empire is illiterate in the language of its own doom. And again, those words sound like Medes and Persians. That is the end of our chapters for today. Did anybody read the fun facts, by the way? The what? The fun facts on the back. Did anybody see the second one? I had brought chocolate in case anyone noticed that. I do have a question. Do you all like the fun facts on the back? Okay, all right. I didn't know if anyone actually read them, and I have fun finding these, but I don't know if it's worth putting them in sometimes. Okay, all right. The takeaway that I want to hold on to for these chapters, and we're going to have one discussion question for that takeaway, is we're learning what it means to have integrity. So I put this in the second paragraph on the overview. Chapter 3 is focusing on courageously refusing idolatry. We saw that with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they refused to bow to the statue, and they do it courageously. They will not give in an inch. We're going to see that in Daniel when he's going to speak truth to power, but with compassion. When he tells Nebuchadnezzar his dream, he does not back down from it. I am someone who does not like confrontation. I have to hype myself up to talk to you all in this room. When it started with 6 of you, it was really intimidating. I can't imagine being like Daniel talking to a powerful king and using harsh words. So for me, that part really stood out of I wish I could do that like him. He probably did it because he prayed. And we can do that too. The other part in chapter 5 is declaring judgment without compromise. And so we saw that again with Daniel talking to Belshazzar. He tells him his dream, and there was no good news or compassion there, but he continued without compromising the message. I find those to be very powerful moments. Now, I'm going to play this song for you one more time, and then we're going to have a discussion question.
Meshach, Abednego stood up and told Nebuchadnezzar no. Into the fire they were thrown. Through the smoke he could see they were not alone. As the flames started bursting higher and higher, they could plainly see a 4th man in the fire. In the heat of the flames, trusting God is a fire department, he's a rescue squad. A 3-alarm response, just cry out his name. He's walking with you in the heat of the flame. In the heat of the flame. Things were heating up for Daniel one day. A lion tried to put him in his grave. When that beast roared into the pit, God showed up and took care of it. That lion lost the fire in his eyes and lay like a kitten at Daniel's side. Daniel's side. In the heat of the flames, trusting God is a fire department, he's a rescue squad. A 3-alarm response, just cry out his name. He's walking with you in the heat of the flame. 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 In the heat of the flames, trusting God is a fire department, he's a rescue squad. A 3-alarm response, just cry out his name. He's walking with you in the heat of the flame. 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 In the heat of the flame.
What is he saying before rescue squad after trusting God?
He's a fire department. He's a rescue squad.
Thank you.
Alex, I thought you told us to read 3 through 6.
I just heard Marilyn say that. I forgot. Though I was trying to figure out when I was finishing the presentation, I was like, I thought we were doing the Lion's Den today. We will do chapter 6 next week. That was just me being dumb. Thank you for your graciousness. Here we go, Anne. You get the chocolate since you. Well, that's all right because God's gonna make that cat take a nap. Here is how we're gonna end today because I really want to focus on Daniel's a story about how to live with integrity for us. So, to me, the main 3 lessons that stood out, I just said them before the song, but is courageously refusing idolatry, speaking truth to power with compassion, and declaring judgment without compromise. Again, we saw the refusing idolatry. They refused to bow to the statue. We see that speaking truth to power with compassion when Daniel talks to Nebuchadnezzar about his other dream, and the declaring judgment without compassion when Daniel interprets the writing on the wall. How do you see those things being applied today? In particular, how do you see yourself doing those things? So how do you refuse idolatry? Or how do you speak truth to power? And how do you declare judgment? Maybe you don't declare judgment, but how do you be uncompromising in God's message? Let's change the language to that. That is our discussion question, which, if I can find my mouse, we'll look at for 3 minutes. Here it is. Talk amongst yourselves. I feel like for that one we should have had 5 minutes, maybe. I'm curious how some of you all answered this, and I really enjoyed getting to listen to Bill. Because Bill said, it's been 2,500 years, and we're doing the same thing. And that's very true. And that is why, again, Daniel is a timeless tale. Same thing with Revelation. People have always been people. Empires have always been empires. And God has always been working through us to fix it. We are a generation that is also experiencing some of these same things. Name whatever president that you thought was a dictator that was doing bad things, or any other world leader. Maybe right now you feel like Daniel living in exile in an empire that's going against God, and it looks like it's the end of the world. Every generation has said the same thing. And that means that for every generation, we are called out like Daniel to be those that speak the truth to power. If you don't feel like that's true for you right now, wait for 8 years and you will. So for this, like the story of Daniel, this first part, I didn't want to just call it court stories or the court tales. It's the stories of resistance. And that is something that all of us can participate into as well. And if that gets too tiring, wait until next week when we'll get to the visions of hope. Because right now, yes, it is true. We are living in an empire with big bad King Babylon, who is the picture of any bad king in the bad empire. And we are called to live with integrity in that. But one day God will act. That's the whole story of the Christian message and the Christian hope. Right now, we are boots on the ground. But one day, that mountain, that big rock will come and crush the statue, and it will never be able to be moved. I didn't mean to give a little mini sermon. Sorry, I got excited from what Bill was saying. But I do want to hear how some of you all answered that question. For you, how can you live with that integrity? How can you speak that truth to power? How can you declare God's message without compromising?
I have a friend who won't forgive her sister for something she said to her about 20, 30 years ago.
Wow.
And here's an example. She saw her at a family reunion wedding, and the sister didn't say, she won't even look at her, It's just amazing. She never forgiveness. So, I don't know what Anna might have said to her. She's a gentleman.
Sometimes trauma can run deep and can be unforgivable.
In families.
Yeah. I know I heard lots of you with, yeah.
Janice was saying that, as we were saying, we're just little people, what can we do? We need somebody to be a leader like Daniel. And Janice was saying, Justice Knox is one of those things where we can give our voices to Justice Knox, and then those people who have decided to be the leaders in Justice Knox can get things done.
Yeah, that is true. We've talked a lot about being a Daniel, but don't forget the role Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or whatever their real names are, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah played as well. The very first time Daniel stood up in resistance, he went to his friends first, and they prayed together. And that is what Justice Knox is like for us. It's when we come together to comfort each other, to pray, to think together. Yeah.
I'm curious about something on the earlier topic. What is the origin of fire being not limit, but the worst kind of punishment that we can have? And the Hebrews come up with that. I mean, it's a big thing throughout.
People have always found awful ways to make things torturous, but fire is pretty simple. I don't know if it's the most extreme version of death, and I don't know. Also, I'm having a vague memory that there was an iron smelting guild near the Zurga, the big temple in Babylon. I don't know if that's true, but if that would be related or not.
It seems like that which is used a lot.
I mean, fire, I think it's scary. When I was a kid, I stuck my hand on a burner, and I still have a scar on my wrist.
If fire is the opposite of water, you have living water.
I like that too.
Fire yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
and then there is
it's also purifying. God is like fire; it purifies us.
And fire is very elemental and very necessary. Heat and water.
Yeah, I mean, with the flood, water was bad at that point. Maybe anything can be used for good or for bad. We should use it for good. I saw Marcia with a smirk, and I feel like she at least had a thought. You.
I have a hard time looking at your questions and not thinking of the political situation now.
Yeah.
And my responsibility in that, my feelings about what is going on. So, again, joining Justice Knox is one way, but I think it has to be a more personal response, not just a corporate response.
Yeah, I mean, I think for many of us in this group, the reason you all asked to do Revelation was because it was right after the election. And it was scary and with uncertainty. And so a lot of people are like, hey, Revelation's that book about the future, right? It's not about the future. It's about how you live now. To just use an example from our presiding bishop in some of the current political climate, you all may know about Episcopal Migration Ministries, which for years has helped refugees resettle in the United States and throughout different parts. Our house has a mother-in-law apartment, like mother-in-law suite apartment in the downstairs. There's a refugee from Afghanistan that lives there. I don't want to share his story on camera, but he is in part still supported, or was, by Episcopal Migration Ministries. That's gone now. And our presiding bishop chose to close it because he didn't want to participate in what he thought was a racist new settlement program with white Africans coming in, South Africans coming in. That's one way. That's a hard choice. No one wins in that. Like, that's sad, you know? But that is one way that our church in particular is standing up to current.
Why did he close it? I didn't understand.
So there, all year since January, there has been no new refugees placed through like the national program and funding that works through Episcopal Migration Ministries until this month when they were going to settle, I think it was 43 white South Africans that would not typically apply as someone who is a refugee, wouldn't quite qualify in that. And so our presiding bishop, Sean Rowe, made out a public statement. There was also a follow-up to that this week because of some outrage that they won't participate in that because he's calling it, it's a racist policy. And so they will shut down the whole ministry because they won't participate in it. I think that's one example, like, that's hard because, like, there's no good in that. Like, that's just sad. I mean, it really is sad. But that's one way that our church is dealing with the current reality. And we will do that through every administration. There are moments to stand up. There are moments we like and moments we don't like. I feel like we need one more way of ending. That's a sad way. What has been your one hopeful part for you in Daniel? If we could have a few people share that.
One what?
One thing that's hopeful for you while reading Daniel.
Well, that he survives being brave, and he survives. Not only does he survive, but he's elevated.
Yes, multiple times, and he survives through multiple regimes.
He survived saying no to the king.
Yeah, and our church will too.
The power.
The Lord be with you.
And also here.
My God, we pray we would be a people like Daniel who can speak truth to power with compassion, but also declare your message without compromising. May we be a people who encourage one another, who stand with one another, and who stand for you. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
So what chapter is doing?
Do what?
What chapter is doing?
So next week, chapters 6 through 8. 6, 7, and 8.